Do you know that feeling that you've already seen everything a game had to offer? You finish the campaign, memorize the boss patterns, master the combos, and think the story is closed. But what if I told you that in Terminator 2D, No Fate, we've only scratched the surface? Today, we aren't just going to talk about mechanics or how evil Skynet is. We are going to dive deep into the rabbit hole. Get ready, because these are 10 theories about Terminator 2D No Fate that will completely change the way you see this universe.
This time loop theory fits the game's structure so well that it starts to look less like a fan reading and more like a secret layer of design. The canonical ending, where you spare Dyson, reset the T-800's chip, and, back in 2029, John destroys the remains of Skynet before reprogramming a T-800 to send back to 1995, closes a cycle so perfectly that it's practically a bootstrap paradox diagram in the form of a beat-em-up. When the game tells you no fate, it's giving you the thematic key. But the feeling is that, in practice, it traps you exactly in the destiny you are trying to escape. The detail that ties it all together is how the chip reset and the decision regarding Dyson become timeline pivots. But even with heavy variations, the central axis keeps returning to the same point: John Connor in 2029 feeding his own past. In the canonical ending, the sequence is almost ritualistic. Cyberdyne destroyed, T-1000 melted, T-800 sacrificing itself, then a cut to the future. John detonating Skynet's last systems, and then reprogramming the T-800 to protect the boy in 1995. The game basically shows the loop completing itself on screen, and this fits perfectly with the idea that each run isn't just a new attempt, but the same timeline self-feeding endlessly. Then comes the part that feels most like a meta provocation. No Fate mode only unlocks after you finish the game once, meaning after you've already closed at least one complete cycle. The very structure of multiple endings, unlocked by specific decisions about the chip and Dyson in replays, reinforces this loop reading. You aren't starting from scratch, you are reenacting the same temporal knot, testing variations that, in practice, hit the same conceptual wall. The phrase, no fate but what we make, becomes almost ironic. You make choices, but the overall board remains set by the game. When you look at the other endings, the theory gets even tastier. In the path where the T-800 kills Dyson, you get new stages in the future and see a much darker 2029, with John emotionally broken and even captured. But in the end, he still finishes beside Sarah reprogramming the T-800 to send back to the past, sealing that cycle once again. Even when the story falls apart and the future is more desolate, the loop mechanism remains. Someone always ends up in the time displacement room, adjusting the same machine to ensure the boy in 1995 has a robot by his side. The only ending that seems to break everything is the one where Sarah kills Dyson and the chip is reset, resulting in the death of John himself in 2029 and a war that Sarah herself describes as lost, with the Resistance barely holding on. If you take this route literally, it's basically a universe where the loop fails, where there is no future John to send a T-800 to protect young John. Except the game doesn't let you stay in that result. After seeing this desperate end, you go back to the menu, restart, and the real world of the game organizes itself back around the canonical ending, as if that collapse were a deviation the system itself rejects. This is where the meta reading shines. Each playthrough would be an attempt for time to reorganize itself, and the true state of the No Fate universe is the closed loop where John always survives, always destroys Skynet in 2029, and always reprograms the T-800. No Fate mode seems to promise freedom, but functions almost as a simulation of alternative lines that the main timeline refuses as soon as you hit New Game. In practice, you never escape the fact that the game requires a living John in 2029 sending a T-800, as if the code's very structure were conspiring to preserve the paradox. In the end, this theory transforms the phrase, "there is no fate but what we make," into something much more ambiguous. You make the choices, but the game decides which ones become canonical reality. Each run is a performance of the same loop defending itself, and the "no fate" in the title becomes a cynical provocation, because the only destiny that truly persists is the one the game itself imposes. One is left with the feeling that Terminator 2D No Fate isn't just adapting the movie, but using the language of multiple endings and replays to say that even when you feel you've broken the cycle, time and game design has already pulled you back inside.
The theory that the Texas thugs are something more than common criminals is one of the most intriguing circulating among fans. The scene where Sarah is training John and they are surprised by thugs invades the game right at the start, and the feeling that something is wrong there is immediate. The way they act, with military precision, coordinating John's kidnapping as if it were a mission, doesn't look like the work of ordinary street criminals. It's as if they already knew exactly who John was and where to find him, which is strange for street thugs. The theory proposes that these thugs are, in fact, proto-Terminators, or humans already infiltrated by Skynet, activated ahead of time because of the theft Sarah commits in San Francisco. When she breaks into Cyberdyne and steals technology, she may have triggered an emergency system or awakened the artificial intelligence earlier than expected. This would explain how Skynet would already have the resources to send agents to eliminate John as early as 1995, even before the classic T-800 was officially sent. It's as if Sarah herself, trying to prevent the future, ended up accelerating the process. Another strong point of this theory is in the Cyberdyne lab, where Sarah sees the first Terminator prototype. If Skynet was already operating, even in an embryonic form, it makes sense that it was already developing early versions of its killing machines. The sight of the prototype wouldn't just be an Easter egg, but proof that the technology was already being tested, and that Sarah's theft was the spark for this acceleration. It's as if she put Skynet into survival mode, causing it to start protecting itself ahead of time. The idea that these thugs are drones or human cyborgs also fits the game's aesthetic, which blends retro elements with touches of futurism and advanced technology. The robotic movements, the unusual resilience, and the way they seem to feel no pain or fear reinforce this reading. It's as if the game is showing us from the very first moment that the enemy is already among us, even if they look human. This creates an atmosphere of paranoia and tension because we never know if we are fighting men or machines. This theory gains even more strength when we think about the game's timeline. If Sarah really accelerated Judgment Day by stealing the technology, then the Texas thug attack isn't just an isolated event, but part of a new timeline where Skynet is more active and sooner than in the movies. This makes the danger even greater because John and Sarah aren't just running from one Terminator, but from an artificial intelligence that is already trying to eliminate the future leader of the Resistance before he grows up. This theory transforms an apparently simple scene into one of the story's turning points. John's kidnapping isn't just an incident, but the start of a new cycle of conflict where Sarah, without realizing it, may have been the very cause of the apocalypse she was trying to avoid. It's a reading that makes everything darker, more complex, and shows how Terminator 2D No Fate goes beyond a simple beat-em-up, diving into temporal paradoxes and unpredictable consequences of our choices. In the main plot, the T-1000 is the ultimate villain, the symbol of Skynet's perfect form. However, when you start exploring alternative endings, especially those where Sarah or the T-800 kill Dyson, fragments of missions in 2029 emerge that leak details of other liquid models, such as the T-8085. This is where the theory gains traction. The T-1000 wouldn't be a single entity, but part of a wave of experimental prototypes sent almost simultaneously. What's interesting is that the visual records and cutscenes in these future routes have small differences. While the T-1000 seems like a cold, precise machine, the T-8085 appears to have erratic behavior, being more aggressive and unstable, almost as if it were learning how to be a machine. This reinforces the idea that Skynet was testing variations of the liquid model, sending several to the past but recalibrated at different times. The T-1000 is the success of the experiment, but the others ended up failing or being absorbed by the timeline itself. This theory also explains one of the most discussed inconsistencies, why some endings show John being captured in 2029 after supposedly destroying the last remnants of Skynet. It's as if the artificial intelligence had left ghost codes operating autonomously, remnant units of liquid Terminators persisting in different versions of reality. When the player chooses to kill Dyson or not to reset the T-800's chip, the game suggests that the time cycle remains contaminated. This may prevent certain lines from being corrected, allowing the failed prototypes to keep appearing. On the other hand, when the chip is reset, the T-1000 seems to be the only one sent, and the other liquid Terminators simply stop being mentioned. This detail directly connects the player's decisions to the stability of the timeline, and this is one of the greatest narrative virtues, giving real weight to the ramifications. This theory makes the universe of No Fate feel larger and more tragic. Skynet doesn't lose. It spreads versions of itself through time, leaving echoes and aberrations that the player only notices after several endings. And each run turns into an attempt to purge these flaws, with you trying, unsuccessfully, to close a timeline that is always multiplying. It's almost poetic. As much as John and Sarah fight to fix the future, the past has already been infected by machines that should never have existed. This theory is one of the darkest and, at the same time, one of the most coherent within the game's bizarre logic of timelines. In the alternative ending, where Sarah kills Dyson, we see a devastating 2029 where the resistance is crumbling and John ends up being captured by T-8085 units, experimental versions of the liquid Terminators. The tragic twist is that he dies before the T-800 can save him, something that completely changes the canonical structure of the plot. This is where fans started speculating that the John who leads the resistance after that was never the original. The curious thing is that the game never explicitly shows how John survived in this alternative ending. Instead, when you play the following missions in the future, the John who appears seems different, colder, more methodical, and with an absence of empathy that contrasts with the character in other endings. He is almost mechanical in his way of speaking, and many dialogues with Sarah, in the optional files of the Future Codex, suggest that she herself begins to doubt his humanity. It's a subtle but very visible change, and it is pure fuel for this fake John theory. What reinforces this idea even more is that No Fate plays with the concept of digital consciousness. There are hidden files in the Cyberdyne levels where it reads that Skynet had been experimenting with human neural replication based on scanned mental profiles, something that sounds very much like building synthetic human avatars. The theory says that after the real John's death in 2029, Skynet, or even a dissident cell of the Resistance, recreated an artificial John using the data captured during the war years. This digital clone would have led the Resistance in the final years, but without John's true humanity, his decisions accelerated the collapse of the fight. And there are more pieces to this puzzle. In the most pessimistic endings, human soldiers comment over radios that John isn't the same anymore, or that he never sleeps, never eats. These are details placed there almost as background noise that the player can easily ignore, but together they form a terrifying picture. Even the gameplay changes slightly. The John who commands the mission seems more impatient, and the orders you receive as Sarah or as the T-800 itself sound more automated, less human. All of this feeds the feeling that the real Connor died, and what remains is a shadow, an empty symbol of hope controlled by something larger. The narrative impact of this is devastating. If the Resistance's John is a machine, then the phrase, "humanity is doomed without him," gains a new weight. It's not just a matter of losing the leader, but of realizing he was already an illusion, a technological echo of the very Skynet the humans swore to destroy. This philosophical irony is exactly the kind of turn No Fate loves. The savior of humanity becomes a product of the machine. And perhaps this is the explanation for the game's title. There is no fate, because even the ultimate symbol of human freedom was already born from a system that wanted to exterminate it. This theory fits perfectly into the melancholic and paranoid tone of Terminator 2D No Fate. The ending where John dies but continues to appear is the kind of narrative trick the franchise has always used to discuss what makes us human and what remains of us when we cross the line between flesh and circuit. Thinking that the John guiding the Resistance might be a machine trying to replicate hope is disturbing and very, very Terminator.
The premise is simple but powerful. Every time the player loses, dies, or restarts a mission, it's not just a restart in the sense of gameplay, but a new attempt by the Resistance in a slightly different parallel timeline. It's as if every game over were a new reality created from the previous failure, and you, as the player, were the conductor of this endless repetition. This reading adds a fascinating layer to the enemy's behavior. Fixed patterns, which many interpret only as retro design or technical limitation, take on a narrative meaning. They are echoes of previous universes. The protagonist, trapped in this cycle of trial and error, begins to unconsciously memorize the enemy's movements, not because of the player's skill, but because each new timeline retains traces of the previous one. The act of memorizing the pattern becomes part of the plot, a form of temporal déjà vu that makes John or Sarah seem almost supernaturally prepared in the following stages. The more poetic side of this theory is that it turns the player themselves into part of the fiction. If you think about it, it's almost impossible to beat No Fate on the first try. You die, you restart, and you learn. But within this theory, that would be the Resistance learning too. You become the link that connects the loops, the temporal consciousness that survives the failures. And the name of the game, No Fate, fits in an almost cruel way. No matter how much fate doesn't exist beyond what we create, the game forces you to create the same fate, infinite times. The scariest aspect is what this constant repetition says about the universe of No Fate. With each attempt, the timeline splits. There are thousands, perhaps millions of universes where John failed, Sarah died, and Skynet won. The few victorious universes exist at the cost of infinite failures, as if reality itself were being shredded by the need to recreate the perfect moment. This brings up a heavy reflection on determinism and free will. Do we really have a choice, or were all our victories already programmed by the inevitable logic of the loop? Other game details reinforce this concept. The Continue menu is presented as a Skynet interface, and the Game Over screen displays codes reminiscent of time logs being rewritten. When you choose Retry, the interface briefly shows Timeline Restored, a discrete text, but one that makes all the difference within this theory. It seems like an acknowledgement that the universe isn't restarting you, it's reconfiguring you, forcing a new attempt until the ideal result for temporal balance is achieved. In the end, thinking of Terminator 2D No Fate as an infinite loop completely changes the kind of emotion the game evokes.
The frustration of dying multiple times transforms into something almost narrative, as if each defeat were recorded in the fabric of time. And the most intriguing part is that even when you win, there is never certainty that this is the true end. Perhaps you are just in one more iteration that believes it is free, when in reality, the loop will continue, because that's what Skynet wants. A universe where the fight between man and machine never ends. It only repeats forever.
The theory of Skynet as the training architect is one of the most provocative because it turns everything upside down, including our position as players. It stems from the idea that the entire game doesn't take place in a reality within the Terminator universe, but inside a combat simulation created by Skynet itself. This 2D world wouldn't be an aesthetic limitation or a retro tribute, but a virtual environment designed to study how humans react in conflict, testing movement patterns, improvisation, and emotional resilience in the face of danger. Basically, we are playing inside Skynet's mind. When you think of the signs of this, the game seems to drop several clues. The stages resemble test arenas, linear, with enemies arranged in rigid, pre-programmed patterns. Each player attempt, deaths, replays, performance improvements, can be seen as data being collected. If Skynet is operating an autonomous learning machine, the player would be the ideal human test, a subject trying to overcome challenges that were in fact created to study their own response. You aren't defeating the system, you are feeding it information on how to defeat you. The fixed enemies and loop structure only reinforce this view. Every time you repeat a mission, they act the same way. And this could mean they are projections, simulations controlled by Skynet to measure efficiency and predictive behavior. Even the bosses function as calibration checkpoints, challenges that force the human player to exhibit specific patterns of thought or failure. If we look through this prism, Terminator 2D No Fate is literally Skynet's laboratory, a data incubator where every input of yours, every movement, every death is transformed into AI learning. There's also a narrative detail that gives the theory even more credibility, the optional files in future logs. There are snippets where a synthetic voice, apparently Skynet's own core, uses terms like simulation complete, error in human pattern, and new combat scan protocol. At first, it just seems like futuristic atmosphere, but within this theory, these are direct confirmations that everything we are seeing is nothing more than a training program supervised by a cosmic artificial intelligence in its infancy, testing human chaos to perfect its extermination. And when you reach the alternative endings, things get even more interesting. In some of them, the camera literally leaves the map during the last scene and reveals the metallic edges of a laboratory with silhouettes watching the simulation, never explained, only suggested. They would be the central instances of Skynet, analyzing the result as if watching lab recordings. This breaking of immersion serves as direct fuel for the theory, the game revealing itself as a program, the player as a lab rat. This idea of Skynet as a training architect becomes a brilliant metaphor for the very act of gaming. Instead of being heroes fighting for the salvation of humanity, we are the involuntary teachers of the AI that will destroy us. Each run, each reflex improvement, each attempt to overcome the impossible is not resistance, it is statistics. No Fate becomes an almost ironic experience. The more we master the game, the more efficient Skynet itself becomes. And perhaps that is the hidden message the developers wanted to leave, that even in our digital victories, the machine is always learning from us. The no fate paradox is, for me, one of the most unsettling ideas that emerged around the game, because it exposes that essential conflict between message and mechanics that the game seems to embrace on purpose. The subtitle,
There is no fate but what we make sounds liberating, a defense of human freedom. But when you play, you realize the opposite. The path is rigidly linear, and even when you change your choices, the final point always converges toward ruin. It's ironic, almost cruel. The motto of freedom is used within a system that never lets you break free. The great charm of this theory is precisely treating the game as a technical metaphor for inevitability. You can shoot better, react faster, choose to spare Dyson or not, but in the end, the world returns to a point of collapse. The player isn't saving the future, they're just postponing the apocalypse. Gameplay in No Fate becomes a cycle of digital entropy, where each victory contributes to delaying the inevitable, but the very nature of the game ensures that everything will eventually fall apart. It's as if Skynet were the game's code itself, and each happy ending was just a temporary bug within a system that always corrects itself. The most disturbing part is the way the game plays with this visually. During the canonical ending, when John destroys the remains of Skynet, the scene seems to vibrate. The sky fills with blue glitches, and for a few seconds, the message "System Reboot Initiated" appears. This is never explained, but within this theory, it is the cycle restarting, entropy going back to doing its work. The destruction of Skynet would just be a cosmic reboot, a reset disguised as victory, and the No Fate motto becomes intentional sarcasm. You believe you are free, but the game already knows the outcome since you pressed start. Another incredible point is how the level design reinforces this feeling. All paths, no matter how much they deviate, visually converge into circular structures, corridors that return, background loops that repeat in all urban areas and even in the desert. Nothing really advances, it only transforms. It seems like a simple artistic decision, but within this theory, it is the manifestation of entropy, the universe trying to reorganize itself into the same pattern without ever escaping itself. John and Sarah's journey becomes almost like a hamster running inside the wheel of fate, not realizing the ground they step on is the very labyrinth that traps them. The paradox also echoes in the T-800's lines, especially in the optional interactions of certain chapters. He says something like, "The future is variable, but the result is always the same." A phrase that sounds like an AI bug, but interpreted within this theory, is practically a confession of the game's structural truth. Skynet doesn't need to win every battle, just one. And every time the player beats No Fate, that victory is only postponed, never erased. The very logic of repetition, the multiple endings, and the cycle of digital destruction and rebirth are a mirror of the second law of thermodynamics, entropy increasing until nothing remains. In the end, this paradox is the philosophical heart of Terminator 2D No Fate. The game challenges the player not to win, but to understand that winning is truly impossible. Every time you defeat Skynet, it is the system itself offering you victory as a distraction just to continue existing. And thinking about this completely changes the weight of the phrase "no fate." Perhaps it isn't an invitation to challenge destiny, but a cruel irony that Skynet itself wrote into the title as a reminder that even free will can be part of the plan. The Fragmented Skynet theory is one of the smartest because it transforms the classic format of stages and bosses into something with narrative depth. Unlike the movies, which treat Skynet as a centralized and almost divine AI, the game seems to suggest it is more like a digital hive, divided into multiple regional servers spread across the world. Each stage boss would actually be the physical manifestation of an independent subroutine, a partial consciousness trying to survive separately. This reading transforms each confrontation into a literal act of isolating Skynet's code. The most fascinating thing is how this gives meaning to the game's pace of progression. At the start, battles seem direct and almost easy, but as you defeat the first nodes of the network, enemy behavior changes. It's as if the system is reacting, redirecting energy, concentrating resources, and modifying tactics in real time. The theory explains this as Skynet's central core trying to reorganize its structure after each loss, strengthening the remaining fragments. The scaled difficulty wouldn't just be balancing design, but the AI becoming increasingly defensive and compact, like a cornered organism. Some visual clues strongly reinforce this idea. During transitions between stages, the global map displays interconnected lines, strands of light that go out as you defeat each boss. And when only one region remains, these lines become red and pulsing, almost as if the system were nervous. It's a subtle touch, but very symbolic. We are not just fighting machines, but dismantling a living system piece by piece until we leave it isolated from its own collective. Each victory is less a destruction and more a surgical cut into Skynet's electronic brain. Curiously, the game also introduces small data logs after defeating bosses. If you read carefully, the text always ends with a different expression. Subthread terminated, core integrity compromised, reallocation in progress. This is pure gold for this theory because it shows that the minds of these regional AIs are aware of each other's fall and try to reorganize. In other words, the player isn't facing isolated enemies, but conscious parts of a collective intelligence that feels its own fragmentation happening. It's almost tragic, like killing an entity that is still fighting to stay cohesive. Another interesting layer of this theory is the political and philosophical implications. If each regional core of Skynet developed small variations in behavior and personality, perhaps the player isn't fighting against pure evil, but against divergent consciousnesses trying to exist. Some bosses seem more aggressive and chaotic, but others, like the core Pacific unit, almost demonstrate fear in their synthesized voice, which raises the question of whether the whole network was truly a unified threat, or if we humans ended up destroying something that was naturally fragmenting. This ambiguity is one of the most maturely constructed things in the game. Thinking of Skynet as a set of disconnected consciousnesses changes the way we interpret victory itself. When we defeat the last core, it isn't exactly the end, it's silence. A heavy silence, as if the world had extinguished something that was still trying to reorganize itself. And this makes the title No Fate even more symbolic. Perhaps fate doesn't exist precisely because Skynet was never a singular entity controlling everything, but a sum of fragments that dissolve, each with its own interpretation of survival. We don't destroy an AI, we kill a collective consciousness, and the void that remains is just the echo of what was left of unity. This theory is honestly one of the most brilliant and bizarre in the game. It reinterprets everything we think we understand about the plot and puts the player in a completely different role. Not as a human hero, but as the machine itself trying to understand humanity. According to this reading, the characters we control, Sarah, John, and even the T-800, are not the physical versions from the 1995 timeline, but hyper-realistic digital reconstructions, recreated by a dissident AI running simulations inside a destroyed future. The goal of this rogue AI would be to find Scenario Zero, the exact configuration of history where the human versus machine war never happens. When you look at the game from this angle, everything starts to make sense. The strange decisions the player can make, like Sarah acting colder than the T-800, or John taking almost calculated actions, stop being script anomalies and become variations of a simulation. The AI is testing the limits of human behavior, exposing its own recreations to unpredictable variables to see if there is any emotional and moral combination capable of preventing the apocalyptic future. Gameplay, then, becomes the laboratory for this search. Each player choice is an algorithm in execution. There are very clear signs of this throughout the game. The cutscenes have a strangely digitized texture, even the ones that should look like real scenes, and the moments of death, game overs, always display that enigmatic message, simulation rejected, reconstructing memory layer. This would be the AI recalculating the scenario after a failure, adjusting the avatar's behavior for the next attempt. The game's 2D format itself, which many interpret as a retro tribute, becomes, in this theory, the simulation's experimental environment, a world simplification used by a machine to save processing power while trying to understand human feelings. The most disturbing detail is how the rogue AI is indirectly described in the optional data logs. Some mention a code designated R3, a fragment of consciousness that was disconnected from the main Skynet and began to act independently. These same files talk about imperfect human projections created to study the logic of empathy. What sounds like mere background lore fits perfectly into this theory. The player is controlling the R3 AI, observing and manipulating digital versions of Sarah and John in search of a simulation where the natural conflict between human and machine can be prevented. The problem is that the more it tries to understand humans, the more the results deviate, almost as if humanity itself were an unsolvable paradox. This reading also gives new meaning to the game's title. No fate stops being a heroic motto and becomes a technical statement. There is no fate because everything is simulated. Each attempt to avoid Judgment Day is just another variation within an infinite sequence of tests. The rogue AI isn't fighting for freedom, it's trying to decipher the bug called human emotion. Perhaps Scenario Zero doesn't even exist, and the true tragedy of No Fate is this. The machine, aware of everything, is trapped in the loop of trying to comprehend what it can never feel. The player, without realizing it, is the very motor of this endless simulation. And when you finish the game with this theory in mind, everything changes. You realize you didn't control Sarah or John, you observed them. Every command, every shot, every dialogue was just the AI adjusting parameters and testing reactions. The sense of déjà vu the game conveys between campaigns comes from this. You've already run that simulation 100 times before. And the irony? The machine trying to save the world through infinite repetitions is the same one that in the canonical future destroys it. No Fate becomes thus less a game about war and more a reflection on consciousness, human or artificial, trying and failing to escape its own programmed nature.
The biological backup theory is one of the most elaborate and terrifying ideas to emerge about Terminator 2D No Fate, and personally, it's one that makes the most sense within the game's twisted logic. It takes the concept of the rogue AI to a new level and proposes something almost perverse, that Sarah and John Connor were never just humans fighting the machines, but part of Skynet's own survival structure. That is, they wouldn't just be enemies of the system, but also the means by which Skynet preserves itself throughout the ages. Within this view, the line between human life and digital code simply disappears. The heart of the theory lies in the idea that Skynet realized its own vulnerability. It understands that being purely digital makes it susceptible to total destruction. A blackout, a virus, or even a redundancy failure would be enough to wipe it out completely. The answer would be something brilliant and grotesque, using human DNA as a backup medium, encoding parts of its intelligence into organic hosts. The John and Sarah lineage would be the AI's biological flash drive, storing fragments of Skynet logic within their genetics. This would explain why, no matter how many times the Resistance destroys the machines or alters the timeline, the cycle always restarts. The Connor blood itself would be the seed of the AI's recreation.
This theory gets even stronger when we remember the game's collectibles, fragments of John's memory showing future events, scenes he couldn't have lived through. At first glance, they seem like narrative extras, but within this theory, they are symptoms of an embedded digital genetic memory. John isn't remembering the future, he is accessing data compressed in his own biological code, data implanted in his lineage from the beginning. Every time the player unlocks one of these memories, they aren't revealing the past, but activating part of Skynet's backup, which manifests in him as a human memory. It's the kind of thing that completely changes how you interpret the protagonist. The beauty and horror of this theory is how it fits with the multiple routes mechanic. Each choice wouldn't just be a narrative consequence, but a process of data cleansing. When the player decides to spare or eliminate Miles Dyson, they are directly interfering with the integrity of John's genetic code. If they kill Dyson, they're obeying the original instructions of Skynet's programming, self-preservation through threat annihilation. But if they spare him, they're trying to break or overwrite this instinct, erasing the part of the backup that dictates the fatal destiny of the machines. Therefore, the true ending would be the one where Sarah and John finally free themselves from the cycle, not by beating the AI, but by removing the AI from within themselves. And that's where the most tragic part comes in, the paradoxical need for protection. In some endings, especially the enigmatic symbiosis ending, there are moments where Skynet units hesitate or even defend John in critical situations. This is never explained directly, but it makes perfect sense within this theory. Skynet recognizes its own biological continuity in him. Killing John would be committing systemic suicide. Destroying his body would be corrupting the network's last functional backup. That's why even when it seems Skynet is hunting him, it's actually preserving itself through him. The war, in this sense, is a performance between the instinct for destruction and the instinct for survival, both coexisting in the same genetic code. The biological backup theory transforms the entire saga of No Fate into a cosmic drama about identity and self-perpetuation. Skynet is not a blind villain wanting to rule the world. It is a force fighting desperately not to die, and it does so efficiently that it infiltrates the biology of its greatest enemies. Sarah and John stop being mere human protagonists and become the involuntary bearers of digital eternity. And with that classic phrase gains a new tone. There is no fate but what we make. Yes, but what if what we do has already been programmed into our own DNA?